This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio is brought to you by the IEEE Computer Society and by IEEE Software Magazine. Online at computer.org/software.
This is Sam Taggart for SE Radio. I'm here today with Emily Bache to talk about katas and the importance of practice. Emily is an independent consultant, YouTuber, and technical coach. She's the author of 2 books related to coaching and teaches courses for Pluralsight and O'Reilly. She founded the Samman Technical Coaching Society in order to promote technical excellence and support coaches. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you. It's lovely to be with you here today.
So to get started, you're most well known, or at least I know you best, for your collection of katas. So maybe we could start by talking about what is a kata.
Well, it's a small coding exercise that you can use to practice skills and get better at things like refactoring and test-driven development.
So often katas are associated with code retreats or coaching. Are these exercises that I can just go do on my own?
Well, yes. I mean, a lot of software developers will do that. They'll just find an hour or so that they've got time to practice and open the code kata in your favorite IDE or editor. And you get to choose from a number of different programming languages for most of them, or some of them are just from scratch and you start with an empty editor. Some of them you start with a piece of code that you need to refactor and build on. And then you can just spend the time writing the best possible code in the best possible way and improving your coding skills.
Great. So do you ever have trouble selling this practice idea to management? I assume people are doing this like during their work time sometimes. Do you ever get any pushback from managers? Because I can imagine some managers saying, well, you want to learn, but why don't you just learn on the job? Like, why is practicing outside of normal daily work useful?
Well, the thing with a code kata is it's a lot simpler than your production code. So you can really focus on the skills and the moves of coding well and gain the fluency that you need to be able to do that in your production code later on. So if you spend some time practicing doing a particular refactoring, using your shortcuts, you'll find that when you need those same things in your production code later, they'll come to you more easily. You'll be able to code more quickly and get the code into the editor and into your production code more fluently and easily and better and raise the quality of your work. So whether you should do that on work time, some people have argued that you should do this on your free time as a kind of investment in your own skills and your personal development. I think that's a little short-sighted for employers to think that developers are going to do that. I think it's actually in everyone's interest that there is at least a small amount of work time allocated for personal development and getting better at your job. Everyone wins from developers who are improving the whole time. So those are the kind of things that I would say to managers. It doesn't need to be a lot of time, but some time spent practicing and improving will benefit the organization as a whole and could be work time.
That leads into my next question, which is how often do you recommend that developers do katas? Is this like a daily, weekly, monthly type of thing?
Well, it depends a lot on your previous skills and knowledge and how much pressure there is in your project, because you don't want to be doing this kind of practice if you're feeling really pressured and there's a lot going on and you don't have the headspace. Or on the other hand, it could be a good way to relax and calm down if you're in a really stressful situation. But still, I think it's got to be agreed with the team and the individual and their manager. But something like, an hour a sprint should be all right, or a couple of hours a sprint, maybe, yeah.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit, your comment earlier reminded me about where katas come from, because I used to do like some martial arts, and I feel like in martial arts, you do the katas and it's about like building muscle memory. Is that like similar when you're talking about like shortcuts and things like that?
Yeah. So this idea of fluency, things that you can do without really having to think a lot about it. It's an aspect of skill. So knowing how to do a refactoring, so one of the code katas, I want an example here. One of the code katas I like is Parrot. It allows you to practice the moves of converting a switch statement, a conditional, into polymorphism with class hierarchy. And usually there are a few steps to this conversion, and it's not something that you need to do every day when you're working in your production code, but when you do, it's good to know the moves and know how to do it safely and extend your design and make it more extensible for the future. So a bit of time spent practicing on the Parrot code kata means that you've just got all those moves kind of, like you say, in your muscle memory. And it goes much more smoothly when you need to do that in your production code. There's a difference between knowing in theory what the moves are and having practiced them and being able to just bring them out. You've got so much more brain capacity left over for the rest of your job, basically.
Yeah, the other thing I've noticed about katas in the comparison to martial arts is like doing martial arts, you do a kata, and if you have somebody watching you, like an instructor, they'll come in and they'll just like tweak one little thing, and then you practice again, and it makes it very easy to focus. By doing it over and over again, you can focus on like tiny little details. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, although, I mean, it's not usually somebody else observing me. I'm observing myself. And often it's like, I think there should be a better way to do this. And looking like my tools have extensive refactoring capabilities, a lot of which I don't know as well as I could. So it's about thinking, is there an easier way to do this? There's a lot of manual steps in this part of the refactoring. Let's see if there's a good way to do this with the tool instead. So reflecting on your own habits and how you're working is part of doing a kata. Yeah. And some people publish, so I publish now demos of me doing code katas, like little videos. And that can be a way to go back and think, you could do it like that too. Maybe I should try that in my tools.
Yeah, I find it interesting. Every time I do them, you can kind of you end up in a slightly different place every time.
Right. So that's a difference with the martial arts, because I get the feeling with the martial arts, you're supposed to do it the same every time and there's some kind of ideal that you're heading towards. Whereas that's not the case. With the code kata, you probably do it differently every time and learn something different every time. And that's part of the joy of it, actually, that you're continually learning and improving. Yeah, it's not about doing it the same every time.
I think in the martial arts, it can be used that way. I think often it's used because people are trying to get promoted to like a new belt or something. And so like they have to do it exactly the way the instructor wants them to do it. And it's kind of graded. Whereas like when you're doing code katas for yourself and coding, for me, it's always like, it's just exploration. It's kind of almost like a fun, playful thing of like, let's start here and see where we end up and see, what happens if I use this one tool as opposed to another, or if I try this, I did these two refactorings, but maybe what if I do them in the opposite order? Does that lead me somewhere else or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Being playful and creative and learning more about how to code well. And there aren't any wrong answers. There's no way to do a code kata wrong. Well, actually, if you break all the tests and the code doesn't work at the end, then yeah, okay. But, within the reasonable definition of success, there are a lot of ways to solve a code kata.
Yeah, you hit on something too. The other thing I like to practice when I practice them is taking those small steps. Because I feel like one of the problems in software engineering is we try to take too big a step sometimes. So breaking things down into smaller steps I find quite useful.
Well, it's the classic, isn't it? How do you solve a big problem? Well, you break it into pieces. And the skill of being able to take, you've got a goal for where you want the design to go, and being able to break down the steps to how to get to that design and how to build the pieces and make it work at each stage. There's a huge benefit in being able to work that way so that the code is working after each of those small steps, rather than trying to take one giant leap and the code being broken for a long time in between. The style of coding where you can work in small steps, I think is more effective. You're more in control, and you also have more opportunities to change direction and end up in a better place than the one you first envisaged.
Yeah, I always think about that as taking big steps could get you there faster, but it's always more risky. Yeah. Like by taking those smaller steps, you're guaranteeing that like as you go along, you're not breaking things. Because if you make that big step and you do it all at once and it works, hey, that's great. You just saved a ton of time. But if it doesn't work, then you spend a bunch of time going back and trying to figure out what's wrong. And it tends to take a lot of extra time.
A lot of software developers aren't really aware of that. And I think just practicing on code katas gives you that awareness of, actually, I've spent too long on this. I should have had passing tests by now. Maybe I need to rethink and back up and try again. And you can do that in a code kata in a way that you might not in production code.
Yeah. So you mentioned there are different types of skills that you can practice with a code kata. What are some of the skills that you can practice? And can you give us some examples of how you would practice those? I'm
quite a fan of refactoring katas. So like Parrot that I mentioned before, for practicing a particular transformation of a design. A lot of the refactoring katas, though, actually you start with code that has a really bad design and very little structure. And the challenge of those ones is to practice cleaning it up and imposing a structure and getting to a point where the design is easier to understand and extend. often a refactoring kata has a new requirement that you need to implement. And before that's going to be feasible, you've got to get the code into a better state using lots of smaller refactorings. So that's one aspect, just getting better and more fluent with transforming a design from one place to another. Another thing that people practice, of course, is just test-driven development. Starting with just a problem description, some code that you need to write, and an empty editor. How do we get there? Using TDD, which is like the first test that you write, what happens when that fails, and what design do you come up with, and what steps you take after that. So how do you break down that problem into steps and implement them test by test? So that's a great use of code katas. And honestly, those are the two main things, TDD and refactoring.
Okay. So if I understand correctly, like the TDD tests, basically those work in any language very easily because you don't need any pre-existing code, right? You just sit down with a problem statement and you just start. Is that basically how it works?
Yeah.
Okay. And is there a variety in those? Or are they all basically just like, here's an exercise, go start? Like, are there ways to practice different aspects of TDD or different types of TDD?
Well, I mean, I've been playing with this a bit because TDD as a discipline, it's quite big. There are lots of aspects to TDD. And to be successful with it, you need a lot of skills. You need, like the skill to design a test case. You need the skill to be able to refactor away duplication that you may have introduced, like by triangulation. You need the skill of just taking that problem and breaking it into steps and what order to do them in. There's a bunch of other things involved. And if you're not very experienced with TDD, doing all of that at once in the first place is quite difficult. So I've been trying to experiment with, what if we give people the list of test cases and say, so here's a description of the problem and here's a description of the test cases in the order that you should do them in. Or what if we actually give them the test cases, just kind of like comment it out and get them to implement them one by one? Because then you've removed some of the challenge of TDD. You've removed the part where you have to break down the problem, or you've removed the part where you have to design the test cases so that people can focus on other aspects, like just working in small steps and refactoring after each one. So I've got a few katas which I've tried to do that with, and I'm actively using these in the kind of training and coaching that I do. So there are some which are a bit like that.
Yeah, we'll talk more about the training and coaching in a little bit. So some other questions I have. So for the refactoring katas, what languages do these exist in? Are they available in any language, most of them? Or most of them specific to a language or a language feature, right? We're practicing refactoring. There's certain refactorings that only work in certain languages, like certain patterns, things like that.
Well, yeah. I mean, my most famous refactoring kata is the Gilded Rose. And that's translated in like 50 odd languages, some of them very surprising. It turns out you can write bad procedural style code in pretty much any programming language. And I'm constantly surprised. I've got a translation like UML, an XSLT. I mean, these are not mainstream kind of things you think of as programming languages. So code katas can be available in a lot of strange languages. But really, it's all volunteer efforts. So when I create a refactoring kata, I obviously do it in one language that occurs to me. And then usually I'll translate it into the 2 or 3 languages that I might use when I'm training and coaching people. And then it's all up there on open source on GitHub, and people send me pull requests with translations. So a lot of the katas are available in a lot of languages, and it's not primarily me who's done all those translations most of the time.
You also hit on something else that I've found, and that is you talk about writing bad code. I find it very hard to write bad code sometimes. When I'm trying to come up with an example of like, oh, don't do this, like it's almost, and maybe it's because I've practiced a lot, but that like muscle memory, it's like I have to force myself to do it the wrong way. Do you run into that at all?
Yeah. So a lot of the refactoring katas are inspired by production code that I've seen. I've thought, this was really difficult to refactor. I think I need to make an exercise out of this. So that's inspiration for quite a lot of them. But some of them, I've thought it through and thought I need an exercise for practicing this particular refactoring. Can I construct an example that needs that? So some of them are more constructed. And yeah, I don't always succeed in making something that's realistic. But, some of them are better than others.
So yeah, you mentioned production code. So how well do skills transfer from, okay, I learned how to do this in the kata. Can you talk about some examples of where you've seen teams that were struggling with something and then somehow by doing these katas, they learned some skills that they were able to apply?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, this happens when I'm coaching because it's There was one team I was working with recently, and we would do the coaching like I would do a learning hour where we would practice on a code kata and then to work in their production code afterwards all together. And we were using exactly the same skills in the session afterwards. And sometimes it just works really well. And you think, yeah, actually, this learning hour, we're going to use it straight away in the next coaching session. So that's kind of one of my goals, I think, when I'm coaching, to try and come up with a learning hour that's totally relevant to their situation. I can say this particular team, they had some C code that was pretty old and a long function that was really long and complex and that they didn't fully understand. The naming was really poor. It was doing far too much and it needed migrating to C++, to a more object-oriented design, to a more modern way of doing things. And we first spent a lot of time getting it under test. And we used a lot of approval testing and combination approvals, and we got it all under test so that we could then refactor with confidence. And then we did a lot of refactoring exercises and learned about extracting methods, moving methods, reducing the scope of variables. Yeah, all sorts of refactorings that I've got exercises for practicing.
Yeah, that brings up an interesting point. Are there any katas where, like, you take, for example, a lot of places are trying to move away from object-oriented code into more functional code? Are there exercises to, like, take object-oriented code and transform it into functional code, or vice versa, or translate between the two? Is that a thing?
Oh, that's a good idea. Just at the moment, I can't think that I've got any exercises that are quite like that. If the code is well-designed object-oriented code, I don't think it's a huge problem to then translate that to a more functional design, she says confidently. I don't know. I'm not an expert with functional programming myself. I've done a little bit, but it's not really my focus. The problem that I see much more often is that the code just doesn't have very good design. It's pretty procedural, like long, tangled, awkward, badly named. So just getting any kind of structure into that is a bonus. That's much more likely to be my focus than code that's already all right and just needs to be more functional.
Okay. You wrote a book about coding dojos. Can you talk a little bit about, like, what a coding dojo is?
So code katas have been around for a long time. It was Dave Thomas in his blog who proposed the idea after watching his son's karate practice. So that was in 2002, 2003, something like that, when I first read about code katas and started practicing on them. And I was getting somewhere and enjoying this, but I felt that it was difficult to get the people in my team to pay any attention to the idea of test-driven development or doing code katas. I did try, but it didn't really seem to stick. And then I went to this conference in 2005 where these two French guys, Laurent Bossovit and Emmanuel Gaillet, were showing their coding dojo that they'd just set up in Paris. And they came to this conference to show us what it was like to come to their coding dojo. And I thought, well, this is great. This is a way of having a group meeting where you get everyone who wants together to do some code katas together. And we learn from one another and we support one another and we start having a discussion about TDD and how to do that. And this seemed to me to be exactly what I needed to get my colleagues on board with doing TDD. So I went back to my organization and I brought in Laurent, actually. He came and gave us some training so that we could get started with this. And it kind of just went from there, really, that I started leading coding dojos. And I was doing it with local user groups as a way to start that conversation and get people interested and show what TDD actually is. And it seemed to me to be a good way for a group of peers to kind of learn from one another. So that was what led to me to write that book, because I found it worked so well for that.
So that leads me to another question about just katas in general. If I'm a developer and I find one of these katas, I want to go practice it. Do you recommend doing it by yourself? Do you recommend doing it in an ensemble, as a pair, or all of the above?
Well, yeah, basically. I mean, if you're the only person in your team who's even vaguely interested, you might want to just try it out by yourself to start with, so you get some practice and you understand the idea of what you're supposed to do with a kata. So you can absolutely use it by yourself. If you can get a group together of people who are willing to try it, it can be much more fun. You get that kind of group camaraderie going and you can support one another and talk about when you run into difficulties. And you can do all together as a group, ensemble style, or you can split into pairs. It's a little bit less intimidating, actually, to do it in pairs. And then you join together and discuss what you all found at the end. So both those ways.
Do you have any examples of like some of the learnings that take place from like watching other people write code? Like from that pair ensemble thing?
Oh, right. Well, when you're in an ensemble and somebody's at the keyboard that you haven't seen code before, they're bound to be using aspects of their IDE and environment that you haven't seen before. And you'll be like, oh, how did you do that? And it's a great way to just pick up general coding tips. It's particularly useful for people in the same organization who actually have access to all the same tools and maybe just don't know what you can do with them to spread knowledge in the team. That's something I find often, that programmers come out of an ensemble and like, oh, I didn't know you could do that. That's so cool. I'm going to do that now.
The interesting thing I've found is sometimes even the more experienced people learn a lot because like you learn a certain set of shortcuts in an IDE and then they come out with a new version and it has some new add-ons that, and maybe you missed the press release or whatever and you didn't see it. And then you see somebody else do something. And you're like, wait, you can do that? I didn't know you could do that.
Yeah.
Or it happens vice versa, that you're doing something the long way and one of the younger, more junior developers is like, why are you doing it that way? There's a much easier way. And you're like, really? And so, yeah, I find that quite interesting.
Absolutely matches my experience.
Great. So I'm curious, what are the challenges with creating your own katas? Like if I'm a developer, like say I work in a team, is it better to try and create katas that mimic some of the problems that I see on my team? Or is it better to go use the existing ones? Do you have any advice on that?
I think creating a code kata is a little bit more difficult than it looks. So it's a good idea to try out some of the existing ones first. If you don't know which kata to choose, there are lots of experienced coaches out there who will probably be able to advise. I mean, I've got a community of coaches, and quite often people will say, oh, what's the best kata to use for, domain-driven design, practicing this aspect or whatever. People just pose questions. My team needs to learn this skill. What's a good kata for that? And people will be able to give you suggestions. So that's one thing to do first. But if you've got a bit of an experience and you think there's a gap and there needs to be a new kata for a particular refactoring or whatever it is, absolutely give it a go and share your work. Again, there are technical coaches out there who are generous with their time and will give you some advice and say, oh, this is good. Have you thought about doing it like this? Or who might translate your kata into other languages. And I don't know. There's a bunch of people out there who are willing to help.
Yeah, the biggest challenge I've kind of found in trying to create, not necessarily katas, but just like examples for things, is it's hard to find something that's relevant and yet simple enough to explain the problem without it being like overly simple. And people are like, well, okay, yeah, that solution's obvious. So like, why would I do, have you run into that at all?
Usually the opposite problem. I mean, when I've been designing katas, my tendency is to make them too difficult and too complex and have too many steps to complete them. I think there's a huge value in very small examples that you can complete in half an hour. That's a good size of problem where you can just come from code that doesn't kind of look good to code that does look good in a short time. And it can explain a principle like, what is a fake? Or how do you use delegation instead of inheritance?
That brings up another question about code kata. So like how long, like does a typical code kata take like an hour, or do you like time box them usually and say, I'm just going to work on this for an hour and see where I get, or how does that work?
Yeah, you time box them. I mean, if you get over enthusiastic, you can just spend hours and hours doing them. So you shouldn't do that. It's more effective if you practice short and often, I reckon. And I think a good code kata, you can get somewhere with it in half an hour. And in an hour, hopefully, when you've, perhaps not the first time you do it, but when you've done it a few times, you can complete it in an hour. That's probably about right. And less. I mean, definitely less. Some of the exercises I do, I've got demos of them and I complete them in 10 to 15 minutes, sometimes less.
Well, one of the things I run into with the refactoring code katas is sometimes like when to stop, right? Like you've done the main point of the exercise, but you're like, oh, I could polish this, I could change this, I could change that. And at some point you're just like, okay, that's good enough. Do you run into that at all?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's diminishing returns. At some point, you're just kind of tweaking. And the design is equally good for adding whatever feature it was you were trying to add. Although I think you can still learn from that, particularly if you're getting more fluent with your shortcuts and the transformations you're making are still improving the code, then, I mean, you can spend time just tweaking designs. And I don't think that's wasted time necessarily.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it's learning. So I guess learning is always valuable. I guess you just have to balance that against the demands of whatever you're working on.
Yeah, and also where your sources of feedback are. It can be quite useful if you've worked on it by yourself to show the design you come up with to someone else and see, well, do you think it'd be worth doing it like this instead or continuing to tweak? And they might have some good feedback for you.
I think that tweaking, though, is also somewhat useful in the sense that you learn how long it takes to do certain things. And sometimes then you can be like, okay, well, I could tweak this, but it's easy to do later. So I'll just put that off until I actually need it. Because I feel like sometimes people try to like pre-optimize things and like, oh, I might need this in the future. So I'll just refactor it this way. And it's like, I've kind of learned to just, it works, the test pass, I'm fairly happy with it. I just kind of let it sit until I have a need to go back and start tweaking it in order to add some new feature or something.
When you get fluent with refactoring, you can actually make quite big changes quite easily. So yeah, I think it's good to have that experience of realizing, oh, actually, when I'm good at my shortcuts and I know what I'm doing, I can do that change when I need it. I don't need to do it now.
Yeah, I don't know that I've ever actually like made that connection between that and practice, but I think that is part of what it is having practiced it a bunch and getting fluent with it. And also I think part of it too is the tooling in the IDE too. Like if you actually have good tooling in your IDE and you actually know. So one of the things that I use Katas for actually is building IDE tooling. So like I'll build some IDE tools to do some refactoring, then I'll try them out on a Kata and see how it flows. And I find that quite useful to give me feedback on like, okay, yeah, this workflow makes sense or doesn't.
Oh, that sounds really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So katas and this practice is part of what you do, but you also have this thing called Samman coaching that kind of encompasses some of the stuff from katas. Can you talk about what does the term Samman mean? What is Samman coaching? How does it relate to katas?
Well, Samman is a Swedish word. It means together. I chose this as the name for my style of technical coaching, just to make it possible to like Google and find other people who know about it. So it's a style of technical coaching that combines two main elements, one of which is like code katas in the form of a learning hour, and the other part is ensemble. So a technical coach works with developers and development teams to help them to improve the way they work, raise the quality of their code, increase their productivity and happiness when they're working. And the Samman method then is the particular style that I use with these two main elements. So it relates to code katas in that in order to do learning hours, you need a good supply of exercises to bring in. The learning hour adds to the code kata though, just as well as being a chance to do a bit of coding practice, the learning hour structures it as a 1 hour session that you do with a team and making sure that it's as interactive as possible and that there are opportunities for discussion so that you're building not only the skills of the participants, but starting to build up a culture and a way of talking about coding and learning the words that you use when you're talking about design and coding techniques. So learning hour has got more structure than just a coding dojo or a code kata by itself.
So you mentioned communication. Do you have any examples of that, like communication, like spreading, like to other aspects of the organization, or like outside of like the learning hours? Have you noticed that improving in other areas?
The kind of communication I'm talking about is really between developers within the team. So it's like learning the words for things like we're trying to move the design towards ports and adapters, or we're trying to increase the code coverage, but we know what that means. We're trying to increase the support that the unit tests give us for refactoring rather than some number on a graph somewhere. So it's really about communication between developers. The way I notice these sessions helping is that then in the ensemble session, which is the other part of the coaching, where we go into their production code, suddenly the team members are able to explain to one another what they're trying to do more effectively. And they'll talk about the code design that they're trying to aim for more fluently and in a way that the whole team is on board with. That's kind of where I notice it.
That reminds me of like books like the design patterns books and some of the refactoring books, like the code smells, of just like putting names to things. Does your coaching like go over a lot of that type of stuff as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the design patterns book is really old now, but it's still, relevant to know what a factory is and a singleton. And these words should be familiar to all, but they're not always. It's the same with the refactorings and code smells. They're pretty old ideas, but knowing the names of them helps you to communicate more effectively. So you can sit with your team and say, I think we've got feature envy here. And then they might hopefully know what you mean by that. And they'll be able to work more effectively afterwards because they'll see that, they'll be able to talk about it and say, oh yeah, and this is what we do when we have feature envy,
Yeah. Is there a way that you have to measure like the effectiveness of coaching? Like, do you have a method to like say, okay, we went in and coached, and then do you like observe them later in their own quote natural habitat or something to see like, okay, yeah, these ideas stuck, or do you have any sense of that?
So one aspect of the Samman method is that you're not full-time with the team. You have a more intense period where you're sitting with them quite often over a period of a few weeks maybe. And then you go away and perhaps you work with a different team or do something else. And then you come back. And one measure of your success as a coach is when you come back, are they still doing the things that you were hoping that they would be doing, that you were doing last time you saw them, when you were all together? So that's a big motivator for me. It's trying to work out, well, what can we achieve in this coaching block that they're still going to be able to be doing when I come back for the next one?
Do you have like a success story of a particular team that really embodies that?
So one of the things I do is pair coaching. And I've pair coached with Llewellyn Falco, who's another very experienced technical coach. And this was where I really saw the effectiveness of these techniques, was when I was working with one of his teams. And I sat in this ensemble and I was just observing. I wasn't part of it. And one of the people would step up and take the navigator role and start talking to their teammates and saying, oh, we need to do a test for this and it should be like this. And we need to set up the data like this in the arrange step. And then the next person would step up, the timer would ring and the navigator role would rotate and the next person would step up and be able to just carry on. And they were doing test-driven development and they were producing code with tests that had a good design. I was like, wow, they've got this. They've really got this. And this was like the 5th or 6th time Llewellyn had a coaching block with this team. And he was like, yeah, they've got this. They hardly need me anymore. And that was really, really encouraging that technical coaching does work. And I have to say with the teams that I've coached, I haven't been back often enough yet, I think, to see that kind of effect yet. I tend to have been more spreading myself a bit thinner and seeing a lot more teams and having perhaps a smaller effect. But I think that if long-term technical coaching really can transform the practice of a team.
Very good. So you mentioned that Samman coaching has 2 parts. Do you always do them in the same order? Like one session has 2 parts, right? The ensemble and the learning hour. Do you do them in the same order? And how does one drive the other? And can you give some examples of that?
The order is not fixed. My preference at the moment is to do the learning hour first and then the ensemble, just because I'm hoping that we're going to learn some new skill in the learning hour or some new words or new vocabulary that we can then apply directly in the production code when we come to the ensemble part. And that should be the case at least some of the time. Although not every learning hour is practicing a skill that's directly relevant for today. Sometimes we're just learning speculatively about skills and things that we're going to need in the future. Perhaps not even this coaching block, perhaps next coaching block or the one after that. So it's not really important that you do the learning hour first. But still, the goal is always that the team should be learning new things and opening new horizons and new ways of communicating.
Yeah, I feel like it could be like a chicken and the egg problem, right? Because you do the learning hour and you learn a new skill and then you go apply it. But also like sometimes you're working in the code base and you're like, oh, that skill would be useful. And then you go back and do the next one, you would do a learning hour, right? Something like that.
Yeah, so if I've got the breathing space between these sessions, so each session is like half a day with the learning hour and the ensemble. If I've got a half a day or a few days between and before the next one, then sometimes I will be able to prepare a completely new learning hour to address that particular skill that I've noticed that they need. And that's really rewarding when I can get that to work. It doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes it's the next coaching block by the time I've managed to prepare that session that they need.
Do you find that a lot of teams are already doing ensemble programming, or do you find that when you start, you spend a lot of time teaching them just how to do the ensemble as opposed to like teaching them how to do whatever skill they learned in the learning hour?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. When I'm going into most organizations, ensemble is new and they haven't done it before, and the developers don't have those skills. So, yeah, the first learning hour or perhaps two will be focused on, well, what are the roles? What are you supposed to say? How do you do the rotations? Yeah, absolutely. Teaching ensemble skills is usually the first thing. But, they pick that up over the course of the sessions. By the end of a coaching block, most teams have understood what ensemble is. They can basically do it, and they have a good idea of when it would be useful to continue doing that with their teams.
What is the biggest challenge you've faced teaching ensemble programming?
There are lots of challenges with teaching ensemble. The first challenge is getting people to try it at all and be willing. That gets easier when I'm framing it as this is part of the coaching and you're going to learn from one another with me mentoring you as a team. That makes it easier to introduce when I'm there. But then once they've got over that hurdle and agreed to do ensemble, the next hurdle is helping people to feel confident to step up and take the role of talking or navigating and not be too nervous to say anything. And then to feel confident as well to take the typist role without feeling nervous and worried that you're going to type the wrong thing. So it's mostly about creating that safe environment where people know what they're supposed to do, and it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to go wrong. And even for senior people, it's hardest for the senior people in the team, actually, because they're so used to knowing everything comparatively to suddenly being some kind of beginner at a skill. That can be hard for people. So it's really important for me as a coach to put them at their ease and reassure them and make it okay to step into that role.
Speaking of being willing to speak up and stuff, do you run into cultural issues? I know you probably deal with teams from different areas of the world. Does that play a role?
Well, yeah, I have worked with teams with people from different countries, the US, Europe, India. And I wouldn't have said that, there are cultural differences, but ensemble, we're a bunch of developers. We understand code. I haven't found there to be big cultural barriers there. Once you've got people to agree to try it, I haven't found it to be really too hard.
Okay. So do most teams, after they do the Samman coaching method, do they continue then to do ensemble programming on their own, or do they mostly do that when they're in that learning mode?
Yeah, so far it's mostly when I'm there. Very few teams have continued with it when I'm not there, which I think is a shame. I would like it to be different. I think there is a huge benefit to ensemble even without a coach present. I think some of the teams have understood that. There have been a couple who have continued with it. And I think when I've come back to those teams for the next coaching block, it's been like, wow, okay, they have carried on with what we were learning last time and they have improved since I was last here. So I think there are huge benefits to it. But somehow corporate culture, it's just, there seem to be a bunch of unspoken norms that say, no, we work individually. You can't work all together. That the managers wouldn't let us. Even without asking the managers, it's just kind of assumed that, no, we can't work that way in real life. I'm working on that.
Yeah, my immediate question was going to be, is that a real thing or is that something imagined by, I'm sure it's probably in some cases a bit of both, right?
Yeah, of course, at first glance, it seems really ineffective getting a whole team to sit together and work on a task when that's not normal. They could get 5 times as much done if 5 people sat all separately. I think that's just a misunderstanding of how software development works. If you've got a very heavy box that needs to be carried and you ask one person to carry it, they might not be capable of lifting that box. But if you've got a team of 5, they can easily lift that box and move it much faster. And it's getting the people to understand that software development can be like that sometimes. It takes 5 minds on a problem to really get hold of it and move the solution somewhere. One person on their own just doesn't have the mental capacity sometimes to solve some of the programming problems that we are facing.
Yeah, I don't know. I've been working on this analogy lately of a basketball team. And if the coach at the beginning of the game said, oh, these are all the tasks that we need to do, and he assigned them each to an individual player and threw them all in their own court with their own ball, that might work, but that's not really a team, right? And I feel like we use the word team and then we all go work individually. That just strikes me as an odd use of the word team sometimes.
Right. It can be deeply ingrained in a company culture and reward system that each person is going to work individually. And it can be difficult to get people to see that that's not the only way to do things.
Yeah, the incentive structure does not help that very much. Because one of the
Right.
things I've heard people say is like, okay, well, if we do this as a team, then who gets the credit, right? Or
Yeah.
who gets the reward? And it's like, well,
Yeah, I'm being measured on how many tickets I close each sprint. I don't get rewarded for helping someone else close their tickets. Yeah.
yeah,
So the thing is, I'm a technical coach, and that's an organizational problem. That's a kind of process problem. And there are other coaches who are much better at those kind of things than me. People who would work as a scrum master or an agile coach. And I'm very happy to delegate all that side of things to them. If I can, I'd like to work together with someone like that. And so that I can really just focus on the coding and the people writing the code and getting that part to be more effective. And if that's not the biggest problem that your organization has at the moment, then hire someone who can fix your biggest problem. That might not be me.
So I have some other just general questions about Samman coaching. So like, is there an ideal team size? Does it work better for smaller teams, larger teams?
When you're working in ensemble, you need to have enough people in the room that have all the skills you need to deliver the task you're working on. And it's usually around 4 to 6 people is a good size for an ensemble. I've no reason to believe that actually if you needed more people than that because the skills were lacking in the room, I think it could still be effective with a lot more people than that in the ensemble. But my experience is mostly with teams of about 4 to 6 people. And that seems to me quite a sweet spot for a team size for software development. So that's what I would normally recommend.
Is there an upper bound that you've seen like over a certain number of people just gets too many voices?
It depends on the facilitation and the nature of the problem you're trying to work on. I found it more difficult and stressful when you've got 7 or 8 people. And that's why I usually advise, let's take a smaller group, at least when we're still learning. And this is the first time we're doing ensemble. It's probably better to have a smaller group. I wouldn't want to put a limit on it, particularly with experienced teams with hard problems.
Yeah, I imagine there's some self-control of like not blurting stuff out either, right? If you're in the audience, if everybody's talking at once, that just gets to be too much. So like having the discipline, yeah.
Yeah, so that's one of the skills of ensemble is knowing what is my role at the moment and how can I best contribute. And often that's not by speaking your mind all the time. It's by picking your moment to speak.
So another question I have is how often do teams typically do coaching sessions? And is there value in having them spaced out so they have time to practice between, or do you try to cram them all together to learn as much as possible in a short period of time? Or
I've done it a few different ways. You can schedule a block of 2 weeks with coaching every day, and then, a couple of months off, and then another 2 weeks coaching every day. That's kind of intense. At the other extreme, I've done it one coaching session per week for like 10 weeks or so. And that is much more relaxed, and the team has much more time between to practice what they learned in the learning hour and the last session. But it takes ages to get anything done, and you lose a little bit of context, I think, between the sessions. And then another 10-week block is going to be like a year away. And that's, again, I think it's a bit long. So at the moment, I'm generally trying to schedule 10 half days of coaching in a period of 3 to 5 weeks as a kind of medium between those.
so can you talk about like the biggest success story that you've seen from common coaching? Do you have a team where like they started out one way and then after a bunch of coaching, they kind of transformed the way they work?
I think I already told you that success story.
Okay.
That was Llewellyn's team that I work with. Yeah. Other success stories? I worked with a team that was full of quite relatively junior developers, and there was just one person in the team who was a bit more experienced. But still, they were really struggling quite a bit with the code that they were working on. The design wasn't very optimal. It was a bit legacy. And they because they were all so junior, they were really struggling to make progress with it. So through some coaching sessions, we learned some skills around refactoring, and in particular, extract method, naming as a process, think just code smells and names of refactorings. And at the end of a coaching block, the person with a bit more experience was like, well, I feel so much more confident now. talk with the rest of my team and explain to all these junior developers what it is that they should be doing. So he felt a lot more confident. And I could see that these junior developers, they were just starting to blossom. They were just starting to get it and feel confident enough to make changes. So I thought that that was a really good story of how coaching just helped that team to go from barely managing what they were being asked to do to actually being able to collaborate and make progress.
Yeah, that's good. So can you talk a little bit about the Samman Coaching Society and what its goals are and why you founded it?
I've been doing this style of coaching for a few years and found it to be really beneficial. And I wanted to share my methods with the world because I think there's such a need out there for technical coaching. There are so many teams struggling with code that is difficult to work with and to maintain. And they need to learn refactoring skills. They need to learn test-driven development. And the resources that are out there, there were code katas and coding dojos. But I think technical coaching is what I found to really work. And I wanted to spread this. So I wrote the book explaining it as a start. And in association with that, I registered the website, sammancoaching.org. And I started to publish more materials and discover other people doing technical coaching. And some of my colleagues at the time were like, well, we could set something up that would be bigger than just us in this company. So we founded a not-for-profit organization. And the reason it's a not-for-profit is so that people from competitors, basically, could join. And we could share our materials and we could help one another. And in a way that wouldn't be for profit for any of those particular organizations. You're not helping your competitor. You're helping a community. The whole point of this basically is to grow the market because there's a huge need for it. And we're just trying to say, well, if we help one another and do a better job and people benefit from the coaching and tell their friends, then that's going to benefit everybody. So let's help one another and share our materials.
So it's a big coaching kind of collective, collaborative type space.
Well, yeah, in one sense, that's the mission of the not-for-profit. It's to support technical coaches everywhere. Although I have put some limits on who can actually become a member of the not-for-profit, because I want it also to be a way to develop Samman coaching as a method. I mean, what I wrote down in my book was what I was doing at the time. And I'm totally prepared for that not to be forever what Samman coaching is. I want the method to develop and be improved and others to contribute their wisdom and knowledge about how the best ways are for doing technical coaching. And I wanted there to be a trusted group who were in control of the future of Samman coaching. So the society owns the brand and the website, and we have a board and we have, meetings and procedures for how to admit new members who we trust. And we're working on ways to communicate updates to the Samman coaching method so that it can evolve and grow and change and not always just be what I wrote in my book a few years ago.
Yeah, I think that's probably wise. A lot of things like test-driven development and some of those things, like they mean a lot of different things to different people. So having a group to kind of curate that meaning, I think is useful. So it doesn't get too diffuse. So you mentioned something there, just wrapping up. You mentioned that many teams struggle dealing with existing code. Why do you think that is?
It's about skill and culture. A lot of developers actually didn't learn how to refactor at university, and they're not learning it on the job. There's not enough knowledge transfer from more senior to more junior developers. So a lot of developers don't actually know how to improve design of existing code, or at least not how to do it safely. So that's one of the problems, that they don't know how to do it. The other problem is they don't given time, like they need to ask for permission to improve the design of the code they're working with, and that somehow the managers should decide that. I think that's the wrong way to look at this. There needs to be a culture in the development team of, we improve the design. This is how we work. We support one another. We expect that when a new feature gets built, a certain amount of that time will be spent improving the existing design to make it easier to add that feature, that we're not just going to shoehorn it into the design we had before. And so I think this is why organizations get into trouble, because they don't have the skill and they don't have the culture. And it's not enough just to say, okay, developers, right now you've got a refactoring sprint or a quality week where you can fix these problems. That's a kind of like a one-off sheet that doesn't actually solve the problem. You need it to be a continuing, ongoing way of working and with skilled developers who know how to do this.
So my last question that just kind of popped into my head was, do you think there's a role for katas in education? Because I feel like a lot of computer science type education is starting from a green field, right? Here's this problem, go solve it. And a lot of what we do in industry and in production is you come in and there's already this code base and it's like, hey, add this feature, but the code base doesn't really lend itself to adding that new feature yet.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that could be improved about educating new developers. It's not really my area though. Honestly, I've always worked with people who are already professional developers, and that's where I've applied all these techniques. So I think if I'm going to talk about computer science education and so on, I'm just speculating. But if there are educators who are interested and want to use my code katas, I would absolutely support them. I know my code katas are being used a lot for job interviews. So students already practice on them to prepare for job interviews. So there's already knowledge about them in that community. But yeah, probably there could be more.
Okay, great. Thanks for coming and sitting down and talking to me. For SE Radio, this is Sam Taggart. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To provide feedback, you can comment on each episode on the website or reach us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or through our Slack channel at seradio.slack.com. You can also email us at team@se-radio.net. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under Creative Commons License 2.5. Thanks for listening.